Okay, so this week's chapter 8 has a focus on culture. And it is a chapter where we're certainly not going to take everything at face value. It's a chapter where I want you to be analytical of what Clawson says. It is in this chapter that Clawson starts using the word Latino interchangeably or even in place of Latin American. But be aware that this is different from the way that I used it and the way I taught you at the beginning of the semester. For Clawson, he uses it as an alternative to Latin American. And I use it mostly when I'm referring to people in the United States, Latinos, descendants of people born in Latin America. So yeah, be aware of that, so that you're not confused. All right, Clawson starts talking about gender ideals, ideal manhood, ideal womanhood. But the way he does so can be confusing and problematic. I think he essentially equates machismo with masculinity or ideal manhood on pages 193 to 194. But manhood and misogyny or sexism are not the same thing. And so then we break down some of this different terminology. I do think Clawson correctly states that the word macho simply means male. Hombría would be a term for manhood. Machismo does get used to refer to misogyny. A machista would be someone who's a misogynist. For womanhood, we get introduced to Marianismo. Marianismo is the traditional ideal of womanhood, which had to do with the emulation of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And so this traditional idea had included things like being a mother, being kind of passive, being subservient, not being aggressive, kind of keeping your head down. With that said, I have a couple things to clarify. One is that womanhood is different from manhood. They are different but complementary gender roles. They are not the opposite. It's not like one is good and one is bad. One is white and the other is black. It's more like one is your left hand and one is your right hand. They're different and complementary. They're not the opposite. It's not one is your hand and the other one's your foot. Like it's they're different and complementary, not opposite. And the other thing is that Marianismo is traditional ideal gender roles, not current ideal gender roles. So number one, they're not the opposite. Number two, this is historical, conservative, traditional, not the norm today. First thing is, in order to make sense of some of this is just a reminder that there's a difference between sex and gender. And all these examples help exemplify the differences between sex and gender. And so yeah, hopefully this isn't controversial. To me, it seems pretty straightforward, but there's the sex, sort of the sex that you're born with, and then there is the cultural norms for that sex, which are not biological. That would be things like boys should wear blue and girls should wear pink. Those are cultural ideas. Those are not things you're born with that are innate and biological. And these gender roles can be different in different points in history. And so, it was normal for men to wear wigs during the Revolutionary War in the United States. It's not the norm today. And that shows how gender roles change over time for people of the same sex. There's different, and these gender roles are not fixed. So A, they change over time. B, there's also different gendered expectations for different age groups. So you don't have the same expectations for a 5-year-old, for a 15-year-old, for a 25-year-old, for a 65-year-old. You have different gendered expectations of what the ideal gender role for someone of that age is. You don't have the same expectations of them. Then there is the factor of class or income. For example, the traditional gender role of, say, 100 years ago, that this idea that there's a single breadwinner in the family, and it's the man who goes to work and the woman stays at home and takes care of the family. Even back then, when it was the ideal, if you were poor, if the man of the house couldn't make enough money to support the family, then that family couldn't live up to the expectations of the time, because the woman had to work to help sustain the family. And so there's always been a factor of income or class that affects the degree to which people are able to live up to those ideals. And today I'd say it's even harder, especially if you live in an expensive country or an expensive city, to have that traditional gender role of having a single breadwinner be enough to support a family. Then there's different expectations based on whether, for example, the setting, whether you live in an urban environment or whether you live in a rural environment. Would be examples of this. Whether women are supposed to be dressed up and wearing makeup all the time, or whether or whether women are whether it's more normal, more common for women to get their hands dirty and to do some heavy lifting, would be some examples of difference between urban expectations and rural expectations. Before I moved to Wisconsin 15 years ago, back in Southern California, I don't think I had ever seen a woman mow her lawn, for example. And I'm not saying one is right or one is wrong. It's just a cultural difference between urban space and a more rural setting, where it's more common and more accepted for women to do to be less dressed up, to wear less makeup, to wear less heels, and to do more physical heavy lifting. Would be examples of urban versus rural gender ideals. Religion, the religion that a person, the degree to which someone is religious, and the expectations of whatever religion people subscribe to also plays a role in what their ideal gender norms are. There could be differences from country to country, and there could be differences within a country from different regions within the country. Whether you live up in the mountains, out in the desert, in the middle of the city, in an Amish community, etc. There could be differences by country, and there could be differences within the country based on different regions. So these are all factors that lead to differences in gender roles. Race and culture can also influence the ideal gender roles and the expectations. This chapter introduces us to personalismo. Personalismo is the ideal that people should have. It's kind of a status symbol to have influence over others. And so, Clawson talks about this as if it were something unique to Latin America and to macho men. But again, I think one of the drawbacks of this chapter is that Clawson is focusing on the differences and not including the similarities in cultures, which can lead us, I think it's kind of dangerous because it could lead us to seeing the other, in this case, Latin Americans, as, I don't know, weird, backwards, outdated. But again, a lot of his impressions and a lot of things he's saying is based on his experiences in the 1950s, the research from the 50s and 60s, experiences from the 70s. And there's been a lot of change since then in the United States and in Latin America. And so we need to account for that. All right, so yeah, I think we have some of this in the US too. We literally have people now whose occupation is to be an influencer. We have this in social media where people keep track of how many followers, how many friends, how many subscribers, how many likes they get. People being conscious about whether they're going viral or not. But even in more sort of before social media, in the business world, traditionally, it's a long accepted norm that networking is important. And we even have that expression of, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And so that those networks can be really helpful for people in the business world. Ceremonial politeness. So Clawson introduces us to this, and it's this idea that Latin Americans are very wordy. And he gives an example of the language used in an old letter as an example of how Latin Americans are very wordy. I think it's overstated. I think there's a difference between the way people used to write letters and how they write today. And there's also a difference in context. Like, When you're talking, you don't use the same language as when you're writing a formal research paper or when you're sending a text to friends. Like hopefully your language is a little bit different in different settings. Hopefully you're not writing OMG and ASAP and LOL in your research papers. And so yeah, there's the context matters. And you can't take an example from an old written letter and then say, see, this is how people speak. They're overly wordy. Or he also implies that they don't ever want to say no, that they tell people what they want to hear. And again, I think there's just cultural differences. And it's harder for us to notice when we do similar things, when we say things we don't mean. It's just our figures of speech and so forth. And so one example would be like when, you're just crossing the hallway with someone that says, hey, how are you? Or you walk into the coffee shop and the cashier asks you, or the barista asks you, hey, how you doing? Like, it's more like a greeting, not an actual question where they want you to stop and tell them, how you're actually currently doing. Or, when you're learning another language, it can be, people can notice, wait a minute, why do they say that? Like, it doesn't make sense. And we can, but we don't notice when we say things like that because they're just normal to us and we're not analyzing them. But, an example would be like when someone says, hey, what's up? If you're learning English for the first time and you read, hey, what is up? You're going to be like, okay, what is, has a type of question, and up means literally above you. So why are people going around saying, hey, what is above you? They're like, it doesn't make sense. But we don't think of it that way. We know that for us, it's an example of an informal greeting, and it's not literal. And other languages have similar expressions as well that are not literal. Nepotism. So in this chapter, we get introduced to nepotism. Nepotism is when jobs are given to people because of their connections, like say to family members, instead of to people that are the most qualified to fulfill that job. But again, by not comparing it to the US or not addressing the topic with the US, we are left with the impression Latin Americans must have a lot of corruption and nepotism, and then we have the implication as opposed to us. But one example of this would be the fact that historically in the United States, 80% of jobs are unlisted, job openings. That means that most job openings go to people that have a connection with the company that has an opening. Most jobs are not, by saying unlisted, it means, they're not advertised, they're not posted somewhere for anyone to be, to find that position. A lot of times someone at the job will find out that there's an opening and then start recommending, their relative, their friends, their whatever, for the position. And so again, sort of those connections, those networks, end up playing an important role. And it's where jobs are not necessarily going to the most qualified person. They're going to the people who have connections. And we have some of this in politics and the business world. And there are sources online that talk about nepotism in different countries. You know, some are have less of it than the US, others have more. And, you know, we do have sort of legacies of families, political families that get their, the people that are close to them into positions of power. Corruption. We get introduced to something called the Corruption Perception Index. And Clawson's numbers are based on the year 2015. Some students read this backwards, so do make sure you read it correctly. From Latin American countries, the least corrupt in 2015 were Chile and Uruguay. And the most corrupt were Haiti and Venezuela. Some students read the chart backwards. So just make sure you get that right. Now let's look at some more recent numbers. Let's see, Uruguay had a score of 74. In 2023, went to a score of 73, but that took them higher. You know, kind of like B number one would be the least corrupt. So Uruguay went from 21 to 16. Chile went from a score of 70 to 66, so they went down from 23 to 29. The US in 2015 had a score of 76, was number 16, and by 2023 was number 69. Dropped, seen as more corrupt than it was in 2015. Dropped to number 24. Denmark was number one with a score of 91 and was still number one with a score of 90 in 2023. And we could take a look, see, they should have the 2024 numbers by now. Let's see. Denmark still number one. Canada, number 15. United States kept dropping to 28. And Chile still the least corrupt in Latin America, but more perceived as more corrupt than the United States. What is corruption? There's different ways of defining it. This is one way from Oxford Dictionary, I think it is. Dishonest or fraudulent conduct by those in power, typically involving bribery. Not the only way that corruption exists, and not the only way to define it, just one definition. Corruption in the United States. Well, also one of the questions in the United States would be, is it corruption if it is legal? You know, is lobbying politicians corruption? Are super PACs where corporations can donate unlimited amounts for political campaigns? Is Citizens United corrupt? Where corporations are treated like people that have a First Amendment right to spend as much as they want on political campaigns. Or do our politicians or members in the government have conflicts of interest? Like Congress people, getting rich off of the laws they pass, or kind of having insider information that helps them do well in the stock market, etc. And so, you don't have to agree with me, but I would argue that things can be legal and still corrupt. We get introduced to different classes, lower class, middle class, upper class. With regard to the middle class in Latin America, Clawson basically says that historically it's been very small. But again, I think it's helpful for context to compare it with the United States. Historically, historians usually talk about the 1920s as a period in which the United States had the highest income gap in US history. But historians in the future are going to write that currently, right now, we have an even larger income gap than we did in the 1920s. So that means there's a smaller middle class and a bigger difference between the rich and poor. On page 200, there's a graph that tells us the ratio of different countries, comparing the richest 10% to the poorest 10%. And the US actually has a worse ratio than El Salvador, Jamaica, and Uruguay. And so the gap between the richest and the poorest is worse in the US than in these Latin American countries. One of the homework questions for this Thursday asks you about what's the relationship between socioeconomic inequality and land ownership. And 2 bits of information that Clawson gives us that helps answer that are these 2 bullet points. That in Latin America, the poorest make up 84% of all landowners, but they only own 6% of the land. The rich are 2.8% of the population, but they own 81% of the land. And so long story short, wealthy people own the majority of the land. Historically, that's been a big issue since they were rural communities, rural populations, rural countries, where access to land was very important to people's well-being. With changing economics and urbanization, those things are changing and less important. But historically, even conservatives in Latin America have argued that some land reform was necessary because there was just too much land and too few hands and too many people without enough access to land. And actually, I will stop with that one and save the next one for next time, with part 2 of this lecture on this chapter.